What's up, guys? Today the topic of the video is going to be on hyperkalemia, specifically kind of focusing on what's known as the potassium shift. And that just means that when potassium ions leave the cells and what factors cause potassium ions to leave the cell, and it happens in various scenarios and conditions. So before we get into the specific details of hyperkalemia, its definition, how it presents with symptoms and whatnot, I just want to remind you that if you're interested in more free medical videos that can help you in your studies and on board exams, whether it be nursing or medical school or whatever the case may be, please subscribe to the channel. It's completely free and you'll be able to see at the bottom right of the video, you'll see a button to subscribe, and make sure you click that bell so you're alerted of more videos that I put out as time goes by. Okay, so let's get into specific details of this disease. In hyperkalemia, this is just basically mean an increased level of potassium that is in the blood. And that can present in various ways depending on the person, but there's kind of some general symptoms that you'll see depending on how much potassium is in the blood. So you can see a situation of muscle weakness. You can see electrical conduction issues in the heart. So we'll look at EKG changes later on, and we'll look at, as the potassium level increases, what kind of EKG changes you will see and how it will progress to eventually reach what's called ventricular fibrillation, which is usually the patient dies in that situation unless they are resuscitated. And then the last thing is you'll see all various sorts of brain changes. So that will be like the patient could be tired all the way to the patient could go unconscious and then die. So this can be presented in various ways in patients, and so it will all depend on the level of the potassium for the patient themselves. Okay, so I want to kind of jump into the video showing you just how potassium is so tightly maintained, because potassium levels are so important when it comes to neuronal action potentials as far as the electric, basically how your brain tells your body what to do and various parts of your body organs and stuff like that, and how they're controlled is dependent on potassium. So let's basically get into a specific channel that's on almost every cell of the body. There's a channel that's called the sodium potassium ATPase. The sodium potassium ATPase. This channel sends 3 sodium out of the cell while it takes in 2 potassium. So the way I remember this and the way I was taught in graduate school was the song from the Remember the Titans movie, where it was like the song was like na 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 na, hey hey hey, goodbye. So that song, it goes to basically the pattern. That's to help you remember how many sodium go out and how many potassium go in. So you would say na 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 out, KK in, ATP goodbye, because this uses ATP. So that's how I was taught in graduate school, and hopefully that can help you. So basically, this situation is bringing potassium into the cell and sending the sodium out. And this channel is all over almost every cell of the body, and this is how the primary way that potassium levels are maintained. And then you also have these channels that are just opened, and this allows free flow of potassium in or out of the cell, and these channels are specifically used in neuronal action potential repolarization. So I'll kind of go into a little bit of the detail right here, but I'll talk more on it later. This is just kind of a general action potential. At the up phase, so this is basically when the signal is decided to be sent. Now you're sending the signal, and the signal's going through. Well, once the action potential passes what's called a threshold, there's what's called sodium influx, and that will be a massive level of amount of sodium coming into the cell. And then when the action potential is dying down, and you're then having the action potential stopping from that segment of the cell, or the say the axon through the neuron, then this downward phase is called the repolarization. So the downward phase is called repolarization, and this upward phase is called depolarization. The downward phase of the action potential, the repolarization phase, is controlled by potassium efflux. Okay, and you're going to see how this is going to cause some of the symptoms later, and you're going to see how you can adjust this with medication and whatnot and have various changes from that. So that's kind of the general idea behind potassium and how it controls various processes in the body. Basically, everything's done by what's called an action potential, which is an electrical signal that is sent through the body, which your brain can send or various organs use, like the heart also uses its own kind of action potential system to regulate heart rate, to regulate vitals, and to basically cause everything to happen in the body. And potassium, because of this phase right here, it's extremely important that potassium levels are correct and at the right place at the right time. Okay, so now let's get into looking at basically some of the causes of hyperkalemia. This is what's known as the potassium shift. Now, you may have heard of a chloride shift, which you learned about in physiology, but you also talk about what's known as a potassium shift. But usually the name's not given to this because you just kind of learn the general ideas for each and what will happen to potassium from these situations. So because of this video is looking at hyperkalemia and not hypokalemia, we're looking at all of the causes of hyperkalemia, or an increase in potassium. And a lot of these will show an increase of potassium because of potassium leaving the cell. And then at the very end, number 5 on this list, so right here, with renal and adrenal failure, that will I'll show you the mechanism behind that. That's a little bit different, but it's not that complex. It's kind of you've probably learned about it in physiology. Okay, so let's start with intense exercise. So this one has always given me trouble. I mean, I understand it once someone tells me about it. Now it makes sense, but it's very easy to get wrong. You would imagine that with somebody who's undergoing intense exercise, we know that sodium-potassium pump is pretty much the primary use of energy and ATP in the body. And we know that there are 3 sodium going out and 2 potassium going in. And you need this pump to perform like exercise, to perform various activities, to all the things that the body has to do during activity and exercise. These pumps have to be running. So in exercise, you would think, oh, well, you're just going to increase the activity of this sodium potassium ATPase. So that means that if more of this is being activated, right, the plus signs for activation, you would imagine that then it's sucking all of the potassium out of the extracellular space. So out here is the extracellular, this is the intracellular, this is inside a cell. You would imagine that all the potassium is being sent into the cell. But the problem is that in exercise, specifically more vigorous exercise, this system, these get overwhelmed. The reason is, remember I told you earlier that an action potential, this is just a basic drawing of it, this is sodium influx in the depolarization phase, and this is potassium efflux. So efflux means potassium's leaving the cell. This is influx, so sodium's going in. This is the general mechanism of an action potential. And I said that there was 2 channels on a cell. I said that there's these sodium-potassium ATPases right here, but there's also these just generalized potassium channels where potassium can go in or out. And in the case of an action potential, to be able to send the signals all over the body, it's going to use this channel more so, because this channel over here, the sodium-potassium ATPase, is just to maintain the balance of potassium and sodium from this inside the cell to outside the cell. So what happens is these channels get overwhelmed, and basically it can't keep up with how much potassium is effluxing out right here, is leaving the cell. So in case of intense exercise, you're overwhelming the sodium-potassium ATPase pumps, and you're causing a potassium efflux. Therefore, you have increased potassium levels in the blood, leading to hyperkalemia. Okay? So in really intense exercise, you can actually go into a hyperkalemic state, although that would be more common in a patient who would have, I would guess, ion abnormalities to begin with. Okay, so that's number 1. So let me clear some of this out so we can make this neat again. Now we're going to go to number 2. It's hyperglycemia. So in hyperglycemia, that just means you have increased glucose in the body. Increased glucose in the body. And I'm sure when you hear that, you go right to thinking about diabetes, and that would be correct. So in cases of diabetes, there's type 1 and type 2. In type 1 diabetes, the patient doesn't make insulin, and in type 2, they don't respond. But you can also have hyperglycemic states, although in patients that don't have diabetes as well. So this is how this works. The reason that hyperglycemia causes hyperkalemia, or can cause it, is because say you had a cell and we're in a case of hyperglycemia. So there is glucose solutes all over the place outside of this cell, right? Tons of glucose everywhere. there's so much glucose that basically they're taking up the room where water would have sat. So where this solute is sitting, it has some sort of mass and some sort of diameter, right? And water could have been there. So you can imagine that where there's a lot of solutes, then there's a decrease in water, right? So what does the cell do? Well, the cell has water inside, and the cell is going to send out water into this outside space because it sees that there's not as much water outside. When the cell sends out water, whatever ions are now inside this cell, the concentration of the ions goes up. Now, not the actual ion the number of ions. There's a big difference between concentration and total amount. Concentration just means in relation to the liquid around, in relation to like the space that's available for it, let's say. So if there was a ton of water in this cell and there was 6 potassium ions versus there's very little, there's the water all leaves, now those 6 ions, you can imagine there isn't the H2O molecules moving around, and these 6 ions are more concentrated in the cell. In other words, if you close your eyes and you reach into this cell and just grab something, you would have a much higher chance now that you would grab a potassium ion. So because the concentrate after this water heads out because of the high levels of glucose that are all out here in the extracellular space, now these potassium ions in here are all closer to each other, and this increased potassium, the cell sees this as, oh my, we have too much potassium in this cell. We need to send some of this potassium out to where all that water went. So that's how it balances out. And now that it's sent these potassium ions out, this hyperglycemia will then cause hyperkalemia. Okay, so I hope that made sense. I never really understood it until I kind of heard it. I read it in books and kind of saw this kind of mechanism for the general idea behind hyperglycemia and hyperkalemia. Okay, so next let's look at alpha agonists. Now I'm going to talk about alpha agonists and beta blockers together, because if you kind of understand where I'm coming from with these and understand a little bit about signal transduction, this will make sense. So to begin, remember that we have alpha 1 and alpha 2 receptors, and we also have beta 1, beta 2, and then beta 3, but it's usually not talked about. So these are various receptors that are used in what's called signal transduction. In other words, when an action potential, remember I drew that little line and I said that was the action potential, that's the electric signal being sent around the body, and it relies on sodium and potassium. When that electric signal reaches a cell, say this electric signal is now coming to this cell, it has receptors on the membrane that will respond to that electric signal and tell it to do various things. Now it will depend on whether it's alpha 1, alpha 2, beta 1, or beta 2. It will depend on what it's going to respond by or respond with depending on the type of receptor that's on the surface. So in the case of an alpha agonist just means that it's in other words enabling the action of this alpha, an agonist, versus an antagonist will block or do the opposite of. It will basically antagonize it and stop it from working. So an alpha agonist just means that you're allowing the alpha function to work. So in the case of alpha receptors, let's just take alpha 1, that's the primary one we're talking about. Alpha 1 specifically is what's called GQ mediated, GQ. And that just means that it's primarily using calcium to cause contraction. Okay, so there are alpha 1 receptors all over your blood vessels in your body, and when an alpha 1 type agonist, say you have a medicine that acts as an alpha 1, when it sends its action potential to that and it will respond by releasing massive amounts of calcium from inside the cell, and that will cause contraction. Okay, so the way I think of this, to simplify it, there's a lot more physiology behind this, but just imagine that if you have a blood vessel here and there's a cell, if you were to contract that blood vessel really tight, you imagine that this cell has a lot of pressure now that's being pushed on it from the walls, and this can shove ions out. And remember that potassium levels are highest in a cell, so that will result in hyperkalemia. Okay, so that's the way I think about alpha 1. There is other mechanisms that would make more sense. I could go into the details of GQ receptors and look at diacylglycerol and IP3, but there's really no point of talking about all that. I just use this little trick that if I imagine cells getting smushed from the blood vessel that's constricting because of this alpha agonist, that now it's squeezing the potassium ions out. And remember, you can remember it's potassium because there's higher levels of potassium in a cell compared to outside in the extracellular space. Okay, so that takes care of alpha agonists. Now let's look at beta blockers. So to understand beta blockers, you have to understand a beta agonist first before you can block it. So let's take in a situation where you have a beta agonist. In other words, you have a beta receptor, and this agonist, whatever, say it's a drug that is a beta agonist, and it will cause a beta response. Let's take beta 1, for example, or beta 2. So the first thing you need to know is that all beta receptors, whether it be beta 1, beta 2, or beta 3, is GS coupled. That just means, so we talked about GQ coupled earlier on with alpha 1, and that uses primarily calcium to cause contractile type function. In a GS function, you're using what's called CAMP, and that ends up, you could say, it goes through a lot of steps. I'm not going to go into all the detail of CAMP with adenylyl cyclase and whatnot, but basically at the end result is you're causing an increase in the sodium-potassium ATPase. It's using basically kinases and stuff that require ATP, and it requires energy and things to happen in the cell. So you're going to have to increase the sodium potassium ATPase a lot to undergo activity with beta agonist. Okay, so now that we know that, if you're increasing, let me draw another sodium potassium ATPase pump here, and remember our little song, na 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 out, K K in. Okay, so if it's sending 3 sodium out and 2 potassium in, when this channel is being increased because of this beta agonist, that means that you're sucking potassium out of the blood into the cell. But in our situation, we're looking specifically at now beta blockers. Now that you understand beta agonist, we'll just block it. If you turn this off, now all of a sudden you have a massive level of potassium that's in the extracellular space, thus causing hyperkalemia. So that covers it for beta blockers. And then the last one, I'm going to clear everything for this so it makes sense. The last one is renal or adrenal failure. So let me remind you, say this is renal, just referring to kidneys. Say that's a kidney. And we know that on top of a kidney is the adrenal gland. So ad just means on top of, and renal stands for kidney. So this is a kidney, and this is the adrenal gland. I want to remind you that the kidney and adrenal gland is kind of both as a team, but primarily in the kidney. It's responsible for what's known as the renin, angiotensin, aldosterone system. Renin, angiotensin, aldosterone system. Okay? In other words, this system regulates blood pressure. So, whenever you have a decrease in blood pressure, renin is increased. The kidney sense that. It will upregulate renin. Renin will then, an increase in renin causes an increase in angiotensin, and so there's an angiotensin 1 and a 2. So an increase in angiotensin 1 will cause an increase in angiotensin 2, which will then cause an increase in aldosterone. And that's a little bit out of the scope of this, but I said all that to get to here. This increase in aldosterone is what the function of aldosterone. Remember I said that this system causes an increase in blood pressure. Once you get to aldosterone, kind of the final step in this whole pathway, aldosterone, let's say that this is a transporter in the kidney, in a nephron of a kidney. And we know that the kidneys is where urine is produced, but it also it reabsorbs and secretes various solutes and ions and whatnot to regulate our body, basically filter in our blood. Okay, so the function of aldosterone is that when urine is coming through here, or when water is coming through, or whatever, then it will reabsorb sodium. But at the same time it reabsorbs sodium, it affects another channel where it will send potassium into the urine. Okay, so just know, so for what we need to remember is this part, is that aldosterone causes potassium to be sent into the urine to then be sent out the body. Okay, so you're going to secrete potassium into the urine. So in other words, if you have a lot of aldosterone, you are then losing potassium. Now, this is only happening when the adrenal gland and kidneys are functioning correctly. If the kidney is now not working, or the adrenal gland, why I'm saying adrenal gland here is because the adrenal gland is also involved in a lot of this kind of stuff as far as the production of various parts. And we won't get into a lot of the detail, but just know that if the kidney is messed up or the adrenal gland is messed up, you now cannot get an increase in aldosterone. You can't get it. The reason is because in the adrenal gland, the adrenal cortex, a specific segment of the adrenal cortex, is where aldosterone is made. So if the adrenal gland is destroyed or not working, you don't have an increase in aldosterone. And when you don't have an increase in aldosterone, you can't send potassium out of the body, therefore potassium is trapped in the body. Same thing with the kidney. If the adrenal gland's working but the kidney's broken, then you don't have the site of action of aldosterone. So you won't be able to send potassium out because the kidney's not working. So the transporters don't work there. So in both of situations of renal and adrenal failure, you will have increased potassium levels. Okay? So I hope the reason I went into detail explaining all of these different scenarios and components of the potassium shift is because I'm going to release another video on hypokalemia. And there's going to be another group of scenarios where we're going to talk about another 4 or 5 things that decrease potassium levels in the body. And that's important to know that, because if you're looking at a lab value sheet of a patient and you see that they have an increase or decrease in potassium, you can begin to go through each one of these things and say, has this happened? Has this happened? Has this happened? Has any of these things happened? And then you can kind of limit down what's causing the potassium increase or decrease. Okay? So like I said, I'm going to remind you again, please subscribe, like the video, share it. You're welcome to share it anywhere you want to. And it will really help my channel. Like I said, all these videos are free. I will never put any of these videos up for sale or make you pay any sort of money. These are all just to help everybody and to make sure everyone does well on your board exams. I will see you in another video. Bye, guys.